Welcome to Seniority Authority, the podcast where I track down experts to answer your questions on aging. I'm your host, Cathleen Toomey. Let's get smarter about growing older. It's something you're probably dreaming of. It's what millions are working toward. That moment when we throw in the towel, send the last email, close out the final meeting, and walk out of the office or the school or the lumberyard or the retail store, we have retired. But now what? What are we going to do with that retirement? Even though we dreamed about it for a long, long time, it used to be that retirement age was literally the precursor to death. In 1940, when Social Security was enacted, the life expectancy was 65, retirement age. Today, we can expect to live another 20 to 30 years. So what will you do with those decades? After the first few trips and rounds of playing golf and more lunches, what next? Today, we have some of the answers. Welcome to Seniority Authority. I'm your host, Cathleen Toomey. Today, I am so thrilled to have Dr. Teresa Amabile on the program. Dr. Amabile is the Edson Bryant Ford Professor Emeritus at Harvard Business School. Dr. Amabile holds a PhD in psychology from Stanford University and was a chemist prior to focusing on psychology and organizational development disease. As an award-winning researcher and author, her latest book, entitled Retiring, Creating a Life That Works for You, is the result of 10 years of research. The book examines how people approach retirement, and it's a product of Dr. Amabile and her four colleagues, including Dr. Lottie Balin of MIT, Marcy Crary of Bentley University, and Douglas T. Hall and Kathy Cram of Boston University. Thank you so much for joining Seniority Authority.
Kathleen, I'm really delighted to be here with you today.
Oh, I have so enjoyed this book, which I have in physical copy. I've read a couple of times, and it is actually a roadmap for people who are planning on retiring because, as many of us know, one trip, a few rounds of golf, that's awesome, but it can't necessarily sustain us for the next 20 to 30 years. But this is a new phenomena. This is a brand new experience. Tell me a little bit about what the impetus was for you and your colleagues to start this 10 years of research.
Wow. We had many different motivations for doing this, but my initial motivation was a discovery I had made in my previous research. I spent a number of years, about 40 years actually, studying creativity, including what influences people's creativity at work. And I found in that research that people do their best work, their most creative and productive work, on those days when they're experiencing positive inner work life. And that is positive motivation, like feeling really jazzed about their work, positive perceptions of their organization, their team, their leader, themselves, and positive emotions. So that kind of state is very important. But of all the things that can make people feel that way at work, the single most important is simply making progress in meaningful work.
Okay.
The progress principle. So I started wondering, after I published that book, The Progress Principle, in 2011, I started wondering about an implication we had not considered in that research. And that was, all right, if progress in meaningful work is so important, what happens to our inner lives when that meaningful work goes away? How do we cope with that? What is the experience like? How do we deal with it effectively? So I went into the literature in psychology and organizational behavior, my two areas of research, and I found a lot on retirement, but almost all of it talks about how important it is to maintain your health as you go into retirement and how important it is to have wealth, or at least to have saved sufficiently so that you can retire and maintain the lifestyle that you've had. Health and wealth. Not much at all about the psychological and relational and life restructuring issues that people face. So I thought this is a really important set of questions to answer for the field and certainly for people in general. And I managed to attract 4 fabulous colleagues whom you named, and they all came with their own special interest areas and areas of expertise, expanding me beyond my initial idea to look just at identity and other psychological issues into the relational issues, the life restructuring issues. So that made the study much more comprehensive and I think much more applicable to people's real lives. The other motivation for us was that we were all facing retirement. One of us was already living in retirement, and the others were getting close to it. One retired in the second year after we started the project. Another retired 2 years later. Another retired 2 years after that. And I just fully retired this July.
So, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. And we all had personal investment in getting answers to these questions and helping other people to answer them.
I think this connects to something that we've spent some time on this podcast talking about, which is the idea of purpose as connected to identity. And it's a real phenomenon now. What do you feel, and your colleagues, what do you feel is the most common misperception about the idea of retirement living? What do you think most people get wrong?
Oh, to me, it's very clear from our interviews, and we had over 200 interviews that we did in this research. It seems that the most common misconception is that all you need for a good retirement life is money and health. And yeah, those are important. And as I said, there's a lot of research backing that up. Yes, those are important. But if you have that baseline of health and financial security, that does not necessarily mean that you are going to have a satisfying retirement life or a smooth transition into retiring. And that's really what we delved into in our interviews, in analyzing those interviews. And we did some surveys as well. And that's what we try to convey in the book. What else do you need?
The book is fantastic. It really is. And I highly recommend it. I have found it to be really wonderful, wonderful resource. It's Retiring, Creating a Life That Works for You. There's a link in the show notes. You can get it from the publisher as well as Amazon. And, ask your independent bookstore to order it. But let's first talk about identity issues in case people are unclear who are listening. What usually happens when people lose their work identity? Why is that an important subject to talk about?
For some people, it's not important. There are some people we discovered who really don't identify much with their work. And the people we studied are professionals. They're all knowledge workers. Some were high-level managers. And we did ask a lot of questions about the extent to which they identified with their work. And some clearly did not identify with their work. But I would say more often than not, there was at least some identification with the work. And that means that they felt that their professional identity or their organization or their team or the nature of the work itself, those were central to who they were at their deepest core. I have to say that I saw being a psychological researcher, organizational behavior researcher, and being a professor at Harvard Business School, wow, important pieces of my central identity.
Absolutely. I can totally understand that.
And that's true of many, many of the professionals that we interviewed. And giving that up, facing the loss of that professional identity is challenging. Hey, I'm going through it myself right now, and I can tell you it's challenging. I'm lucky enough to be able to have that title of Edsel Bride Ford Professor Emerita forever, right? I get to do that for the rest of my life. Most people don't have that. They don't have a title that they can say, I'm still that. But giving up that professional identity is so difficult for some people that they need to do something to get over the hump if they're even going to get to the point of making the decision to retire. You started the show in such a wonderful way by saying, okay, the day has come, you're walking out of the office for the last time. Well, maybe, but that process starts way before that last day with thinking about the decision. And there are some people we interviewed who are still working, hadn't yet made a retirement decision, and were holding on for dear life, like fingernails, like I am never going to retire, because facing the loss of that professional identity is so difficult. And yet, we found with the people that we followed across the retirement transition had many different creative ways of dealing with that identity loss. The most interesting is something we call identity bridging. That means taking some important piece of that pre-retirement identity and finding a way to carry it across that retirement bridge with you and finding a way to enact it in some way in your post-retirement life. And that can be tremendously satisfying and can really help people make the decision and adjust to retirement once they've actually done it. Let me give you an example. There was one person who was quite a high-level leader in his organization. He was interviewed just once by me. We interviewed many people just once, but a few people across the retirement transition. This is somebody I interviewed about 2 years after he retired. That leader identity was so important to him. He talked about it and how much satisfaction and joy he got out of it. He was worried about what to do with that sense of being a leader once he retired. He found a way to enact it in retirement life by stepping up when he was invited to take on a leadership role in his church. He was invited to join the board, and within 2 years, and he said yes, within 2 years, not only was he chair of the board of trustees of his church, but he was chairing the capital campaign as well.
It's a huge responsibility.
Huge responsibility. He said it was 30 hours a week at least, which to him was way less than he had worked as a leader. But he said it still feels a little bit like full-time work, but he was finding that same sense of satisfaction and joy in it because he had done that identity bridging.
See, that's where I think this can be very revelatory for a lot of our listeners. There is a way that you can approach your purpose and identity in retirement that is not holding on, by your claws, by your fingernails to the job you have, but having something that is richer and different and probably more rewarding. And in the book, you set out some work to do if you want to have a fulfilling retiring life. You have identified 4 tasks that I think our listeners would really like to hear about that help you thoughtfully move and thoughtfully think about that next phase instead of just holding on or walking away without a plan. Can you talk a little bit about the 4 tasks that you uncovered in the process of this phenomenal 10 years of research?
Yes, I'd love to. We found basically it takes work to stop working.
I love that.
The work can be enjoyable for sure, but we found that it does take effort and attention and time to have a smooth transition into a satisfying retirement life. And we identified 4 tasks that really everyone who retires in the U.S. needs to face these 4 tasks, and each of the tasks has their challenges. The first is making the retirement decision.
Mm-hmm.
How and when to retire. Some people start thinking about that years in advance. They have a plan for when they want to retire. Other people don't really start thinking about it until they're in their 60s, maybe, and they're finding themselves a little worn out by work, feeling like not so motivated for their work anymore, finding the organizational changes that they're experiencing not so amenable to them any longer. So there's huge variability in how people think about this decision. Making that decision can be a challenge. We found that it was a particular challenge for one person that we followed across the retirement transition that we call Irene. Irene did not believe she identified very closely with her work. So when we asked her, would you be more likely, this is one of our interview questions, would you be more likely to say that your work is what you do or your work is who you are? Irene said, without question, it's what I do. I really have enjoyed my career. I've enjoyed the work. I respect my organization. I love my team, but it's not who I am. It's what I do. Yet, for 4 years, she struggled with that decision. She'd say, okay, I'm going to retire this year. She'd say that to herself. She'd say it to her husband, her friends maybe. And then she'd take it back. She'd say, well, no, next year. And she asked herself at one point, because there were other things she wanted to do, and she was getting worn out at work, and there were organizational changes she didn't like so much, she asked herself, well, why don't you just retire? She told her interviewer, one reason, people do respect you while you're still working. And after, maybe not so much. So even though she hadn't had the perception that she identified very much with her work, it was an identity issue. She felt powerfully attached to that identity of being a successful career woman.
Yeah.
And it was hard for her to give it up. But when she decided, okay, it's time, I've got to do it. This career, it just isn't suiting me any longer. This lifestyle. She decided, she made the decision, she retired, and she was fine. But doing that first task was hard for Irene. Second task, detaching psychologically from work. And that means no longer finding yourself thinking about work. That means really leaving it behind and orienting yourself toward your future, toward your present, where you are now in your life, and your future. And that detaching can be really hard. We found, again, here, huge variability. Some people, Irene said this about her last day, I walked away and never looked back. And we had other people who said something like that. So that detaching can happen easily. Some people do it before they actually have their retirement date. They're psychologically kind of checked out, even though they're doing their job. They're gone in their mind. And other people, it takes years. We had one guy that we called Jay. We followed him across time because I think he continued to do a little bit of contract work for his firm. He had retired as a partner from his consulting firm. It took him 5 years to go from what he called working Jay to retired Jay.
Okay.
A lot of variability. And this brings up an important point about these 4 tasks. There is no one way to do it right. No single best way to go through this retiring transition. Yes, our book gives not a roadmap, I would say many roadmaps.
Cover.
That's why we picked that as our cover image, because there are many paths to smooth transition, satisfying retirement life. There are also ways that you can kind of go sideways, and it can be much more difficult to go through this transition. And we also have examples of that in the book. The third task is experimenting and exploring with new activities, relationships, places to spend your time in order to build a provisional retirement life for yourself. Some people take a slow approach to this, just saying, I'm just going to be for a while, just live my days, continue with the non-work activities I was already doing before retirement, the ones that I enjoyed, and just see what emerges. Most people felt better in, I'd say, maybe the month or two after they retire, if they had something, just one thing that they started doing that was new or greatly expanded. So
Okay.
we had someone that we call Edward, who loved music when he was young. He had had a rock band. And so many people, so many baby boomers were in a rock band when they're young adults. And he had enjoyed, playing around with the guitar over the years. But, he was busy and raising a family with his wife. I mean, stuff to do, right? So it kind of fell away. As he was approaching retirement, he very wisely began to explore and experiment and build those elements of his provisional retirement life before his retirement date even. He found a group of like-minded friends interested in music and joined their band, began to play occasional gigs with them, and joined a choral group. He and his wife both loved singing. They decided to join a choral group together, and after retirement, those activities became so central for Edward. He did the band by himself. I mean, his wife would come to his gigs sometimes. He loved it. And he started learning a new musical instrument as well. And he and his wife loved this chorus. They did it together. They even went traveling with the chorus to do performances all over the place, even Europe, I think. So the building of a provisional retirement life is a really important task. And it can be started before the actual retirement date. The fourth task is consolidating a satisfying retirement life, a relatively stable one, from those elements of the provisional retirement life that seemed to work best, that seemed most amenable and most viable for the foreseeable future. And by amenable, I mean really suiting the person well. So that consolidation is when you no longer feel an urgency to keep exploring and trying to get your retirement life together. You feel like you're in a relatively settled rhythm and routine, and it seems to work for you. Of course, there are always going to be changes in life in the future. So we say it's a quasi-stable, consolidated state. So those are the four tests: deciding, detaching, experimenting, exploring, building the provisional retirement life, and then consolidating the retirement life.
So if you are listening, take that to heart. One of the things that I love about the research, your results on the research, is that you have this provisional chapter, this provisional task, that it's not just one and done. You don't say, I'm going to join a nonprofit board and that's it. You get the chance to play around, to try something and say, nope, this isn't what I was looking for. Try something else and say, this doesn't satisfy that part of me. It's permission to play at what will feed your soul and your sense of purpose. And I love that. Do you have recommendations or guidelines as to how long the provisional piece lasts versus till you get to your consolidated piece?
The answer is no. My word of the day, I guess, is variability. We found Irene did her exploration and experimentation. She and her husband, Daniel, moved to Cape Cod very soon after she retired. They had always had this plan, and it wasn't far from where they had been living. They had a vacation home there, which they had bought years earlier with the intention of eventually renovating it as their home for retirement. And they moved there right after she retired. Daniel was still working, and Irene's exploration experimentation included supervising the renovation of that house, getting them settled into it, exploring activities on the Cape, some of which she continued with for the long term, like an ocean conservation group and an art class, and some of which she didn't. I think Friends of the Library was something she did for a short time, and then decided it wasn't quite the right fit for her, and there may have been a couple of other things that she had explored. But she found her place and consolidated that quite satisfying retirement life within 1 year of her retirement date. Other people, the experimentation and exploration went on much longer. In some cases, because they just kind of liked it. They enjoyed it. And in other cases, because they felt like it was taking them longer to find something or a group of elements for their retirement life that really felt right to them.
And that makes sense to me. One of the things that I loved about the book is your stars, those people who let you close into their process for up to 7 years. Is there one story to end this interview that stands out in your mind that you'd like to share?
There is. And I just want to say we are so grateful to the 14 people. We interviewed 120, but 14 people allowed us to follow them through their retirement transition, starting before they retired, while they were still working, and then as they went through retirement and into the first few years of retiring. There's one who's very dear to my heart, who I was privileged to be the interviewer for. We called him Lawrence. These are all pseudonyms, of course. Lawrence had decided with his wife when they were about 30 years old that they were going to retire at age 60. And they managed the family finances all those years. Lawrence was a financial manager. He was a project manager with a financial orientation. So that was his bailiwick. And he managed the family finances all those years to be able to reach that goal. And when he saw that target coming into view when he was in his late 50s, he got very excited, talked with his wife. Okay, I think we're going to be able to do it. And unfortunately, he said later, in retrospect, we planned everything well except what to do with our time not working anymore. Lawrence had a very turbulent, tumultuous transition into retiring and a long delay in getting to that consolidated retirement life state, 5 years after retirement. And his story is an extreme one, but I think it highlights some of the most important lessons. He and his wife had been fairly heavy drinkers, but they had been completely functioning, not missing work, being engaged in their jobs fully, getting good, stellar performance reviews, feeling good about their careers. They both retired at the same time, and they had decided that they would move to an unfamiliar city, Savannah, Georgia, which was about 1,000 miles from where they had lived for decades, because their second son lived there with his wife and the toddler grandson that Lawrence called the center of our world. You nodded your head like, I think you remember the Lawrence story from he's in chapter 1, and in a later chapter, we finished telling his story. And they didn't have a deep conversation with the son and daughter-in-law before they moved about what the benefits and perils might be, being in this close proximity, and Lawrence and his wife, Cynthia, not knowing anyone else. But they didn't have that conversation. And after they got there, Lawrence did not take any steps to explore the activities that he had talked about beforehand, like volunteering with Habitat for Humanity. He had mentioned that to me many times before retiring. He had talked about developing and teaching a project management course at a local college down there, which he had done previously in his career where they had lived when he was working. He didn't do any of that. He didn't even take any steps toward it. The only thing he did was part-time daycare for that grandson with Cynthia, and spend a lot of time drinking with Cynthia. And then when a crisis occurred, their son and daughter-in-law separated a few months into Lawrence's retirement, and they later divorced with great acrimony. And that severely restricted Lawrence's access to that center of his world, that grandson.
Sure.
And he had nothing left. He had no other life that he had built at that time. So he and Cynthia sank deeper into alcoholism until they reached a point where the sons came to them and said, unless you get sober and stay sober, you're never going to see your grandchildren again. And that was the turning point. They went into long-term residential rehab, came out sober, and I found out from Lawrence this summer that they are still sober 6 years later. 6 years later, and happily engaged now with family and friends and the recovery community in Savannah. They have community down there now. And they celebrated their 50th anniversary this summer. So it's a great story, but it shows, again, remember that comment he made to me afterwards, that they planned everything well. And by that, he meant the finances and the timing. They didn't have a thought to really deeply considering what they would do with themselves day by day.
That is why this book and this research and this information are so important. Don't make that mistake in thinking you don't have to think this through. This has been a fabulous experience talking with you, Dr. Amabile. Thank you so much for your time. Again, retiring, how to design a life or how to create a life that works for you. Please take this to heart and really think about your purpose.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. I really enjoyed the conversation.
It's been wonderful. That's our show for today. If you liked it, give us a thumbs up, a heart, and most importantly, share it with someone who needs to hear this news. And together, let's get smarter about growing older. Until next time. That's our show for today. If you liked it, please tell your friends so we can reach more minds and keep the conversation going. Or follow us on social at Seniority Authority. I'm Cathleen Toomey. Until next time, enjoy your chance to get smarter about growing older.